Hello and welcome to my hangout today. I'm Susan Woodcock, owner of HomeDecGal.com, and today we're going to talk about pleats and spaces. And if you have any questions, I've enabled questions, Q&A, so I don't see anyone with a question, but you're welcome to type in questions, and we can even continue the discussion after the hangout and ask more questions and answers. And so if you watch the hangout later after it's been recorded, you can still participate in asking questions. Thank you so much for joining me today. This is just a small portion of what's involved in creating custom draperies and window treatments. Pleating has been around forever. I'm not sharing anything new. It is a timeless technique, but maybe you'll pick up a few tips if you're already making custom draperies, if you're a workroom owner, or if you're new to sewing for home decor. Perhaps this will help take some of the mystery out of figuring pleats and spaces and how to sew and tack pleats. I have a slide presentation that I'm going to share today, so let me get that up on the screen. And there's our slide presentation. The title of our hangout today is Custom Drapery, Pleating, Tips, and Techniques. And this presentation includes my own methods for pleating draperies. You might approach this differently, and that's okay. I hope that you'll find what I share today helpful as you work on future drapery projects. I am a visual learner, so I'm going to sort of show things in a visual way. You might be more of a math person, more of an engineer, and you might find calculating pleats and spaces to be a fun challenge mathematically. I'm more of a touchy-feely artist type person, so I sort of look at things visually. So I hope this will help all of you that are not great at math like me. We're going to start with an overview of drapery pleating and then how to figure pleats and spaces. So that's going to be a large portion of the hangout. We'll be doing math problems. So I hope you don't fall asleep on me or leave the hangout. Hang in there. It's not that bad. I have some advice from my mom, who has been sewing window treatments for 50 years. She's a real whiz at pleating, and she actually really enjoys it because she's, like I talked about, more of a math-minded person. And she really likes that challenge. I'll show you how to approach sewing pleats, tacking pleats, and then we'll look at a few different pleat styles. This webinar or hangout today has 45 slides, so we should be done under an hour. So why exactly are pleated draperies so popular? Let's look at that first. Why do we go to all this trouble to take fabric and manipulate it into pleats? Well, there's a timelessness about it. It's a style that fits all types of room decor. You can have pleated draperies in a kid's room, a child's room, a master bedroom, a living room, a kitchen window, family rooms, libraries. And they look great on all windows, rectangular, square, round, arched. So pleated draperies are really a mainstay of interior design. They have a uniform appearance because the pleats and spaces are evenly dispersed. So as you're looking around the room, everything matches. Pleated draperies have the ability to traverse neatly, so they can be opened and closed, and they look as good closed as they do open, and every time they're open and closed, they always look consistent. Pleated draperies allow you to take fabric fullness and create drape and softness in the room. This really does help with interior design, giving you that fabric drape. If you look up drapery on Google, what you'll find is art. You'll find tons of drawings and paintings from the masters of drapery. Fabric really is a beautiful thing, and the way it flows, the way it hangs and drapes, makes a beautiful backdrop to your room. Traverse draperies are operable. You can use them on decorative hardware or traversing hardware with a baton or wand operation or cord draw. Pleated draperies can disguise awkward windows. If you have a window that's really skinny and wall space on either side, you can make the window look bigger. If you have a short squatty window, you can make it look taller. So if you have windows that don't quite match up in the room, maybe one window is several inches shorter than another window, you can sort of make them consistent by hanging all the hardware at the same place. If you have windows that have a odd-shaped divide between two windows, you can put a drapery panel in the middle and one on each side, and you've hidden that. So it's a great way to improve your windows. Pleated draperies provide insulation. The fullness in the draperies gives extra fabric, and then when you add lining and inner lining, you really are creating superior insulation against heat and cold and against noise as well. It helps to quiet your room. And I haven't even added here that pleated draperies can control light. You can have blackout or just lined, offer privacy. And of course, the last thing, they're just decorative. They just look so pretty. I think if you don't know what style you want in your room, do draperies. They're always right. You can't go wrong. And you can combine draperies with Roman shades, with top treatments. So you can never go wrong with draperies. They're here to stay. So now we're going to talk about how to figure pleats and spaces. To begin with, you have to answer these questions. First, what type of hardware am I using? A traverse rod, which is either a cord or baton draw rod, like a white utility rod, like a Kirsch or Graber utility hardware. Or a decorative rod with carriers, and a metal finish or a wood finish that does have carriers and operates and has an overlap. That would be a traversing rod. And then there's decorative pole rods with rings. Yes, these do traverse, but they don't have carriers. They don't have overlaps. It's a wood or metal pole, and the rings just slide on. So you need to know which style of hardware you're using. And then how will it traverse? Is it one way to the left or right, like on a patio door? Or is it a two-way draw, which is also called a split draw, that opens from the center to the left and to the right? So now that you've answered these questions, let's do the math. Okay, so we're going to start with traverse rods, and that would be the utility or decorative traverse rod. The example here is a one-way draw. I'm just showing you what they are visually so you'll get it. One-way draw draws all to one side and has one return on one side. And then a two-way draw is two panels, and they're pleated to fit the left and the right sides. They overlap in the middle on the master carriers, and they return to the wall on both sides. So you have to allow for the overlap and the return. On a one-way draw, you only have to allow for one return. Okay, got it? So what we're going to do in this class is figure pleats and spaces for a two-way traverse draw, and that's the most popular of all. I just want to check my settings here quickly and make sure. I saw something come up. I thought I had muted myself, but it's all okay. And again, if you're just joining us, you can ask questions if you'd like. So here's the decorative pole rod with rings. You can have a one-way draw. You can have where it goes all the way to one side. If you have a large window, you'll have to have a special bracket and rings to clear that center bracket, because if it's a really big window on this style of rod, you'll have to have a support right here in the center. Or right here in the center, I should say. Had my mouse on the wrong screen. But for a rod, let's say a 48-inch or less rod, you don't need a center support. Your rings can traverse back and forth. So do check with your hardware suppliers to see what's available for traversing. You might have to go back to the type of decorative pole rod that has C-rings and carriers. But I've seen a lot of new hardware coming out lately that does have a special bypass bracket, so be sure to check that out. And then the most common two-way draw. The panels are pleated to fit the right and left sides of the rod and meet in the center. Note that there's no master carrier in the center. You just end with a ring here. So you're not going to have a way to overlap them. And this last ring is going to go on that last area past your pleat. You want to allow extra for ease or spring back when you do this style of rod, because as you pull the drapery with the rings close together in the center, you don't have that overlap allowance. So you do want to have a little slack, a little ease, so that you can bring them together and slightly overlap them, just to block light. You don't want that center crack of light coming through, and it just looks better. They're not pulled and drawn really, really tight and stretched. So I'll talk a little bit more about ease as we go along, but it's generally about 1 inch per width. So now that you know how the drapery will need to fit the rod, you can use this to determine what the spaces will need to be. And what's left over goes into the pleats, right? That's just so simple. Well, it's not always that easy. And the reason why is that you're working around seams. You don't want to have a seam in the front of a pleat or in the center of a space. It looks much better to have the seams to the back edge of a pleat. And fullness varies. Sometimes you try to eke out enough pleats with too little fullness. Sometimes you'll be cramming in as much fabric as you can because you have too much fullness. So it's not always an exact formula. Plus, every window is different. Every window size is different. The fabric widths are different. So to make this easier, pre-plan if you can. I'm going to share with you some averages. These are guidelines. Averages are not rules. I'm not telling anyone that this is the pleating rule, but the averages for the number of pleats. You can use this information as you work on your calculations. It'll save time. So the average for one width panel is 5 pleats. Now this has changed. When I first started, or I should go back even further, when my mom, but when I was a kid and Mom had a drapery workroom, it was 6 pleats per width. Fullness was much less back in the 60s and 70s. As we went into the 80s, things started to get a little fuller and a little fuller. So this has changed. You might have some old books that say 6 pleats per width. And in some cases, you might still do 6 pleats per width because these are guidelines, not rules. But for just generally, 5 pleats per width looks really pretty. 1.5 widths, add another 2 pleats, so it's 7 pleats. 2 widths, around 10 pleats. It might be 11, depending on how much fullness you have. 2.5 widths, for 2.5 times fullness, 12 or 13 pleats, 3 widths, 15 pleats. You see the method here. So every time it's 5 pleats per width, and we add 2 to 3 for every half width. A few more averages to think about while you're planning your pleats and spaces. The spaces between the pleats should be around 4 inches. Of course, this can vary based on your style, whether it's a side panel and not traversing, whether you're working with a limited amount of fabric, etc. But generally, try to get your spaces to be around 4 inches. Pleats are usually made up with about 5 to 6 inches of fabric. 5 inches for a line drapery. If you're doing a bump interline drapery, you might need 6 inches of fabric. If you're doing shears and you want extra fullness to give more privacy and more softness, you might want to use 6 inches of fabric in your pleats. So those are general guidelines. And this hangout is going to be recorded and on my YouTube channel. So if you're sitting there trying to take really quick notes, it's okay. You can go back and watch this and stop the video and make notes as you go along. Need to adjust the screen just a little bit because there's a copyright down there at the bottom and the number of slides. So I want to make sure the copyright's showing. So let's start off with an easy window. 34-inch wide traverse rod, split draw with overlaps and returns. I'm just in this brief presentation going to show you a traverse rod. We're not going to do decorative pole rods, figuring pleats and spaces, because it's the same thing, you just don't have an overlap. You add ease instead of overlap. So once you figure out, the overlap is what tricks people up sometimes, I think. So I'm concentrating on a two-way draw with overlaps and returns. So that's how we're going to calculate for this presentation. I look forward to answering your questions and hopefully doing future webinars and hangouts to get in more detail. So this is all I had time for today. So we're going to do pleats and spaces for a 34-inch wide traverse rod, split draw with overlaps and returns. The fabric was figured at 2.5 times fullness, so there's 1 width of material on each side. So the width of the rod measured from the outside to the outside of the rod is 34 inches. Plus overlap in the center, there's overlaps once, 3.5 inches, plus 2 returns, 1 on each side. They're 4-inch returns, so that's a total of 8. So the total I need to cover the rod is 45.5 inches divided by 2 panels, and that's 22 3/4, and I'm going to round up to 23 inches. So after the pleats are sewn in, each panel will need to measure 23 inches across. So first we're going to figure the pleats. You'll finish your drapery panel, put in your side hems, your buckram, do whatever method that you prefer or works best for your project, be it a top-down method, a bottom-up, double fold heading, low bulk heading. After it's all done, your side hems are in, measure across your finished panel. For a 1-width panel, it usually ends up about 48 because your fabrics usually start out about 54 and then you take out 6 inches for side hems. But this could vary. Subtract the size that it needs to be finished after pleating. So we just did that in the last slide. That was 23 inches. So the finished panel minus what it needs to finish, 23 inches, leaves 25 inches for the pleats. So now we're going back to where I talked about the average number of pleats for 1 width is 5 inches. I know that. I'll divide it by 5. Perfect. I have 5 pleats at 5 inches. That's optimal. Yay. Ding, ding, ding. That's a good one. So now let's figure out what the spaces between the pleats are going to be. Measure across the finished panels. Flat is 48. Subtract the return. Subtract 1 overlap because this is 1 panel and the amount used to make up all of those pleats. And I ended up with 15.5 inches. Divide by the number of spaces. That'll always be one less than your pleats. If you have 5 pleats, you have 4 spaces. And that gives 4 spaces at 3 7/8 inches. So remember I said you generally, guidelines, you want about a 4-inch space, and generally 5 pleats about 5 to 6 inches. So this is perfect. We're done. Let's go pleat the drapery. So I'm just going to show you quickly how to fold in and pin the pleats and spaces, and then we'll go back to figuring a little more complicated drapery panels that have seams. So for this single width panel, you measure the flat panel, you do your calculations, and then after you know we have those 5-inch pleats, we're marking the overlap, which was 3.5 inches, and then fold and pin the first pleat. So that's 5 inches. I measure over 5 inches, bring those 2 pins together and pin it. Repeat on the opposite side of the panel, but instead of the overlap, that had a return. The return is going to depend on your hardware. For this one, we had a 4-inch return, and then mark that 5-inch pleat and pin it in place. And you end up with a panel with 2 pleats folded in. Fold the whole thing to the center, because it's 5 pleats. You're going to have one in the center, and measure over 2.5 inches on the fold. That'll give you a 5-inch pleat, and pin it. So now you have 3 pleats pinned into the heading. And some people like to use binder clips or other kind of clips instead of pins. I'm an old-fashioned pin kind of girl. Now fold to the center between those pleats and pin a pleat in between a 5-inch pleat for 5 pleats. Now measure your panel. You should be pretty accurate. You might have taken up a little too much with your pinning. You can let some out. You can also measure between each pleat, because we also calculated that it was 3 7/8 inches between each pleat. But this is a fast way to do it if you have a magic number. 5 is a magic number, and we'll talk a little bit more about magic numbers coming up. So there are the pleats ready to sew, and we'll do more sewing after we calculate more pleats and spaces. I'm going to check for questions, and I don't see any questions, so we'll keep going. So let's go up to a little bit larger window. How about a 50-inch wide traverse rod, split draw, with overlaps and returns. The fabric was figured at 2.5 times fullness, so there's 1.5 widths of material on each side. And we're going to measure the width of the rod. And I guess I should add here, I think this is a mistake that people often make, is that they measure the window and figure their project instead of measuring the hardware or where the hardware is going to go on the wall. Often hardware is, and hopefully, because it looks best, extended past the window on either side. So you always want to measure the hardware or know how much the hardware is going to cover on the wall beyond the window frame. So if I didn't know that, I would figure at least 3 times fullness if I just had a window size, just to accommodate for that. But most often when you're measuring, you already have an idea of what type of hardware you're going to use and where it's going to be placed. So we have a 50-inch wide rod plus 3.5-inch overlap plus 2 4-inch returns, and that adds up to 61.5 inches divided by 2 panels for a pair, and that's 30 3/4. And fractions don't make any sense in pleats and spaces, little tiny 1/4-inch fractions, so just round up to 31. So after the pleats are sewn in, each panel will need to measure 31 inches across. And note that I sketched in 7 pleats because it's 1.5 widths. So now let's figure the pleats and spaces for each panel, for each 1.5 width panel for this 50-inch rod. Measure across the finished panel. It's ended up 66 inches. Subtract the size that it needs to be finished after pleating from the last slide. That was 31. That leaves 35 inches for the pleats. Keep in mind the average number of pleats for a width and a half is 7. So divide 35 by 7 for 5-inch pleats. I like it. For comparison, if you wanted to move up to 8 pleats, they would be 4.25-inch pleats. Now let's see how far apart the 5-inch pleats are going to be spaced. Measure across the finished flat panel, subtract the return, the overlap, and the amount used to make up the pleats, and that leaves 23.5 inches. Divide by the number of spaces, which is 1 less than the number of pleats, and that gives 3.9-inch spaces. Again, this one's ideal. Don't you love it when it works out perfectly? It doesn't always do that, but but for this example, just to help you learn, I used good numbers, so it came out perfectly. So let's get a little more complicated. Now that you've got it, you're sitting back, you feel confident. This is way too easy. I thought drapery pleating was hard. Well, let's look at one that's a little more challenging. Let's figure pleats and spaces for a 92-inch wide traverse rod, split draw with overlaps and returns. The fabric was figured at 2.5 times fullness, so there's 2 widths of material on each side. The width of the rod, 92. We add overlaps and returns. So total, to cover the whole rod, we need 103.5 inches divided by 2 2-width panels. And that's 51.75, so we're rounding up to 52 inches. So after the pleats are sewn in, each panel on the left and right will need to measure 52 inches across. So let's measure across the finished panel with the side hems done, the buckram's in the top, measure across, and we have 100 inches. Subtract the size that it needs to be finished after pleating. From the last slide, it's 52 inches, so 100 minus 52 leaves 48 inches for the pleats. Keeping in mind the average number of pleats for 2 widths is 10. 48 divided by 10 is 4.8-inch pleats. That's okay. We like a 5-inch pleat, and that's pretty close to a 5-inch pleat. Now let's look at the spaces. Measure across the finished panel, subtract your return, your overlap, and the amount used to make up the pleats, and that left 44.5. Divided by 9, which is the spaces between the 10 pleats, and that ended up with 4.9-inch spaces, which is pretty much a 5-inch space. That's a little larger than the average size of 4-inch spaces. So I want to refigure this to see if I add more pleats, if it'll make the spaces a little bit better size. And here's how that looks. 10 4.9-inch pleats and 4.8-inch spaces. So the pleats and spaces are almost identical in size. And what's wrong with this picture? The spaces look too big. Just from experience, I know those spaces look awkward. And there's a seam right in the center of a space. So when the drapery is closed, traversed closed, you're going to see that seam, and it's going to be sticking out like a sore thumb. It's better if the seam can be moved sort of to the left or to the right. So on a 2-width panel, let's try an odd number of pleats to see if that helps. So the finished panel was 100 minus what it needed to finish, and we have 48 inches for pleats. And we have that average in mind of 10, but we're going to bump that up to 11. So divide 48 by 11 pleats, that gives 4.3-inch pleats. The pleats are getting a little skimpy, but it's still okay. And then measure across the finished panel again to determine the spaces, and divide by the number of spaces. This time is 10, and I have 4.4-inch spaces. So just like in the last one, the pleats and the spaces are pretty much the same size, but the spaces are a little bit smaller. So let's see how that looks. That's better. 11 4.3-inch pleats and 10 4.4-inch spaces. The pleats are a little skimpy, but the spaces look a lot better. So I would go with this over the last one. Plus the seam spacing, the seam, as you note, in the center is now to the back of a pleat. So that odd number really did help with the seam placement. It looks even, it looks nice. This would be a good way to go. So here's a comparison of the 10 pleats with the larger spaces and the seam in the middle, and the 11 pleats. The pleats are getting a little slightly smaller, and the spaces are smaller, and the seam is placed properly. But you might not like those skimpy pleats. So if those numbers are not appealing, then there is a solution. Don't figure the pleats and spaces after the panel is finished. Pre-plan by figuring the pleats and spaces before you sew the panel together. The panel needs to finish 52 inches. So take your hardware, figure out what you need it to be, divide it in half, figure out what that panel needs to finish, and then build from there. 52 inches is what I want it to finish. 50 inches is the average number of 10 pleats at 5 inches, using those averages. You have to add your overlap and return. So I need 109.5 inches for the finished panel size. Perfect. But darn, this panel only has 2 widths of material. And 2 widths of 54-inch wide material with the side hems taken out of it and seaming them together will not give me 109.5 inches. So what if the pleating plan was figured before quoting the yardage? In this case, figuring for 3 times fullness instead of 2.5 times fullness would give a lot more options. If the panel was 2.5 widths instead of 2 widths, there would be more fabric to make adjustments. I'd have more fullness in the pleats. And this is only 1 cut of material for the window. You'd split it and put a half on each side. So pre-planning can save time and headaches. If you've pre-planned, then when the fabric comes in, you already know all of this. You can just whiz through the job, do your pleats and spaces, and you don't have to sit there and try to figure out how you're going to eke it out. So for this project, I would have liked to have 3 times fullness. So let's figure this for 2.5 widths of fabric. If I pre-planned and made sure I had 3 times fullness, measure across the finished panel, which now is 124 inches. Subtract the size it needs to be finished after pleating, which was 52. That leaves me 72 inches for the pleats. Keeping in mind the average number of pleats for 2.5 widths is 12 to 13. So divide 72 by 12, and that gives me 6-inch pleats. And I don't know why it says or 72 right there. That was a, let me just make that go away. It is 72 inches, but there we go. So it's divide 72 by 12, we have 6-inch pleats. Now let's determine the spaces. Measure across the finished panel, which is 124 inches. Subtract return, overlap, and then amount used in the pleats, which was 72. That leaves 44.5. And then divide that number by your spaces. We had 12 pleats, so we have 11 spaces, and the size of each space is perfect 4 inches. So I like that a lot, especially if it had inner lining. The 6-inch pleats would look much better, especially if it was a tall window. I love that fullness. Now on this, because there's 2 seams, you have to work around getting those seams placed. So the first seam fell perfectly right to the back of that 5th pleat, from the right heading to the left, from the leading edge going over. The first seam is right on, spot on. The next seam, which is over, I can get my cursor to work, over at the other side. I'm having a very hard time with the cursor here. There it is. This seam ended up right in the middle of a space. So I had to start adjusting on either side to make the seam fall in a better location. So at the top you can see that instead of 6-inch pleats, I have a 6 1/4 inch pleat and then a space, a 6 1/4 inch pleat, and then the seam is really close to that pin, and then the space, and then the next pleat is 5 7/8. So I sort of had to eke out a little bit from one pleat, and then the next pleat over on the was also 5 7/8. So you can adjust your pleat sizes. A 6 1/4 inch pleat and a 5 7/8 inch pleat is going to look fine. Nobody will be able to tell that it's not 6 inches. But your spaces have to stay consistent because it has to fit the rod. If I took fullness out of, started saying, well, let's make a 3 1/2 inch space, it won't fit the rod. You need that 4 inches. You can alter spaces slightly, maybe make a space 4 1/4 and the next one 3 3/4. That's okay, but it's much easier to work with putting your fullness and adjusting fullness in your pleats. So there's the 3 for that window. The panels, the 2-width panels, the first one, which I didn't like, the second one, which I would go with if that was the amount of fabric I had, and then the third one, which would be better if it was an interline panel or bump interline panel, to give those 6-inch pleats and 4-inch spaces. And that one is 3 times fullness with 2 1/2 widths. I'm going to take a little look here at the Q&A, and I'm not seeing any Q&A, so I don't know if they're not showing up for me for some reason. I see the pane and I see the questions, and I'm not seeing anybody typing in. So I'm sorry if that's not working, or maybe you just don't have any questions. That's okay too. So now I'm going to share some pleating with magic numbers and other advice from my mother, Irene Eagles. This is a picture of my mom on her 89th birthday. We spent her 89th birthday sewing in the workroom. She was very happy. It's one of her favorite things to do. So she used to work with me for many, many, many years. She's been in a forced retirement. She didn't want to retire, but I moved to North Carolina, and so Mom and I get together and do some pleating and pillow making and just do some projects once in a while. She still has a workroom set up. She has all the industrial equipment and stuff, so I can go there and visit and work great. We have a really big time. So I'm going to give you some of my mom's advice. You'll see that little picture of all those little handwritten notes. Mom saw a magazine article written by a prominent industry professional who is brilliant, and I love her. And Mom said she made it too complicated. Of course, Mom has a lot more experience than all of us put together. But she thought it was too complicated, so she started scribbling notes to me to make sure that I could share in my classes a simpler way. So it may not seem simple, and what I've been showing you today may not seem like anything that exciting is going to change the workroom world, but I do hope that I've simplified it a little bit based on Mom's approach and how I've learned and how she's taught me to do pleats and spaces. So we're going to talk about magic numbers. Earlier I showed you 5 pleats and how you folded in each pleat on the end, fold the whole panel to the center, mark a pleat, fold to the center of that pleat, and mark pleats. That's a magic number, and that can save a lot of time as you're pinning in pleats. Mom will sit at the sewing machine with a flat panel and just work back and forth like that, folding in to her magic numbers. There are not very many magic numbers. There's 5, 9, 17, and 33. We're not even going to go above 33. That's just crazy. But if you know that you're figuring your pleats and spaces and you have a choice between 18 pleats or 17 pleats, you might go, I'm going to do 17 because it's a magic number. I can just fold back and forth and back and forth. And you even can start sewing your pleats that way. You can sew in the last 2 pleats, the center pleat, and then the pleat in the center of each one of those, and then pin some in and measure and go from there. So that's what a magic number is, and I'm going to show you some graphics for that as well. Mom also says, this was her checklist. She had a little bullet list in her notes. Measure and adjust. If it's too wide, take a little out of every other pleat. If it's not wide enough, add a little bit to every other pleat. Of course, you're working around seams for that. Heavy fabric needs at least 5-inch pleats. Bump inner lining needs at least 6-inch pleats. It's better to have a panel too big than too tight. If you pleat enough, you can pleat at the sewing machine if you have a 36-inch ruler on the front of the machine table. If not, you have to get up and check with a measuring tape to see if you have it correct. And watch out for seams. Measure and adjust to work around seams. So there's our wisdom from Mom Irene Eagles. Thanks, Mom. So here's pleating with magic number 9. I showed you magic number 5. Measure and pin a pleat on each end, allowing for your overlap and return and your first and last pleat. Fold the whole thing in the center and do the center pleat. Then you're going to fold to the center and pin those pleats in. Then you're going to fold to the center of each one of those and pin your pleat. So you can do all this while you're sitting at the sewing machine. I know it sounds awkward, but we've been doing it for a long time, so it really works great when you can do it. When you can't use a magic number, when it's not one of those special numbers, you can still use the same technique for regular numbers. Here's an example of 10 pleats. You'll start with 2 pleats on one end and 1 pleat, 2 pleats on one end, 1 on the other, then find the center. And then find the center between that, and then find the center between them. So that's working back and forth, folding, and either pinning or sewing. I've often sewn to this the center graphic here, where I have all the pleats in except for the very last ones, and then I can kind of adjust with that if the seams seem to be working out right. And it's sort of a sculptural kind of thing where you're working with it and making it work as you go along. This does take a lot of practice, so start out with the 5-width panel and try doing that and see if you like it or not. So for sewing pleats, I like to mark the machine with blue tape. So for this pleat, the needle is positioned the center of the presser foot at 2.5 for a 5-inch pleat. You can either sew from the base of the pleat or from the top of the pleat. I do them both ways. I think it just depends on my mood. My mom sews this way from the base of the pleat up. If you're sewing from the base of the pleat, you may find that the fabric will ride up and move forward so that your pleat ends up uneven. So depending on your machine, whether it's a walking foot or a regular industrial machine, if you have a walking foot, you might not have this problem. But you might have to scooch down the fabric on the top 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch so it's not even. So as it feeds forward, it ends up even. How much that is, you're going to have to sew a pleat and sort of test it. It also depends on the type of fabric, how many layers you have. So just experiment with that. But you'll start at the base, 4 inches down, the bottom of the heading, and sew up and backstitch. Now here's sewing from the top of the pleat down, again using the blue tape to mark the pleat size. When you pleat from the top down, you want to seat the needle, and that's this photo up here at the top. You want to seat the needle down into the fabric about 1/4 of an inch or more and back up and then come forward and sew. That'll help prevent the top edge from scooting forward and making it uneven. So start with a needle, inset down in the down position, and then sew your pleat and back stitch as you get to the bottom. So whichever way you want to sew your pleats, now we're ready to tack the tops. The first one is going to be French pleats, and this is a silk fabric with inner lining and napped sateen lining and no buckram. I don't always use buckram. I like the softness, but this certainly could have had buckram in it. There's nothing wrong with buckram. So for this, I'm hand stitching the pleats. I'm using John James Needles size 7 long darners, Coats & Clark hand quilting thread, and some scissors or clippers, and a thimble. I say it's optional, but my mom says you're supposed to use one. I don't always listen to Mom, but you should use a thimble. It does help save your fingers. Sometimes I do wear a leather thimble. So we're starting by dividing that pleat by pushing down on the top of the pleat to create 3 folds or 3 fingers. It's actually called a 3-finger pleat. And then start with the needle into the center of one of those folds so that the knot will be hidden on the inside. Then wrap all the way around and make a stitch stabbed all the way through. If you have buckram in your pleats, you want to be stitching below the buckram. It'll be very, very difficult to stitch into the buckram. So you're stitching below the buckram and going all the way through. You can also stab stitch side to side so you do not have the stitches showing on the top. That's okay too. If that's your style, that's perfectly fine. This is just the way we do it. And then wrap around again. I'm using 2 strands of thread. You could also use 4 strands of thread. And then as I come out, I'm taking the needle and stabbing down into the stitches to create a knot. And then right beside the knot, if I can get the cursor over there, right beside the knot, I'm stabbing the needle down into the thickness and out, pulling it tight, and that hides the knot. It seats it down into the stitching, and then trim off and leave that little tail on the inside. At the top, I'm going to stitch down through the stitch line so that the knot is hidden inside. Manipulate those 3 fingers of the folds, wrap the thread around, catch one, wrap the thread around, catch the other, and pull them in and stitch those off. And knot it. Again, bury the tail into the thickness of the pleat. And there's the finished French pleat. I do have a comment. I don't see a question. Thanks, Melanie. Good to know that's working. Okay. So there's a French pleat. So let's do different style of pleat. Let's do a goblet pleat. So I'm going to take the French pleat, and instead of tacking it at the top, I'm going to open it up and create a rounded appearance. Stick my thumb down in there, or even a little short ruler, and push it all out so those 3 fingers are rounded. And this looks like a champagne flute or a wine goblet. And then if you want, you can stuff the pleat. I like to use scraps of foam rubber from cushion projects, cut in little short rectangles and squeeze them in there. You can also use pipe insulation from the plumbing department at your home improvement store. I like using up the foam because I hate that you have to throw away all those scraps of foam after you've cut cushions out. And foam and pipe insulation stays in place. It doesn't creep out over time like a polyester batting would. You can, if you want to use a polyester batting, put a little cap on it by hand stitching a little cap of fabric on top. And I've seen a lot of people do that. It's really a nice luxury touch, and it finishes it off beautifully. But you don't have to do that, especially if you're using the foam, because it's not going to poof out. It's going to stay in place. And then Euro pleats. And Euro pleats are extremely popular. Look in any magazine, decorating magazine, and it's Euro pleats on pole rods everywhere. And even cafe curtains are pretty with Euro pleats. So again, you're creating that 3-finger pleat and pushing that down, but instead of tacking the bottom, I'm only tacking the top. So starting off by starting on the inside of a fold so the knot is hidden, and come through the bottom, and then come back around and stab through to the other side. So you're sort of doing a stab stitch, and then back again where you started from, and then you'll have a little place there where you can grab some threads, create a knot, stab through, and then trim your thread off, leaving the tail inside. And there's a Euro pleat. So I'm going to finish up with just some final thoughts from Home Deck Gal's head. And let me see if I have any Q&As. Okay. Remember that every job is unique. So you can't have a set, you know, every job, I'm going to do every job with 5-inch pleats and 4-inch spaces. Yeah, every job's unique. It's not going to work like that for you. You can strive for quality and excellence, but don't try to strive for perfection. Fabric moves and grows and stretches. You can table a drapery length one day in the workroom. It's a perfect 89 inches. And then measure it the next day, it might be 89 1/4 inches. The next day, it might be 88 3/4 inches. Fabric is affected by temperature and humidity, by adding bulk. When you start adding linings and inner linings, you lose fractions of an inch. So striving for excellence and superior quality and great customer service and a beautiful finish is great, but you're never going to hit that perfection, and you'll waste a lot of time trying. Remember that there's so much more to learn. This was just a preview of pleating draperies. I didn't even get into one-way draw or like ripple fold, or, you know, there's so many styles of pleats. I only looked at a 3-finger pleat. There's 2-finger pleats. There's cartridge pleats. There's decorative pleats. I didn't even talk about side panels that don't even draw. So there's a whole lot to learn, and I look forward to continuing with education programs with Home Deck Gal. Nothing beats good old practice and experience. If you have a job and something's coming up and you've never done it before, do like I did in this webinar and take out some scraps of blackout lining and practice to figure your pleats and spaces. Or often I'll have a roll, I don't now, but in the past I've bought really cheap buckram, like when it was on discount, the papery stuff, not to use in draperies, but to use for making pleating plans or making templates and things like that. So practice, even if you're not practicing on a real project. Every job you do, you learn something new and you gain experience. Add 1 inch of ease per width when using decorative pole rods, so the draperies will not be stretched. If they're stretched, they'll spring back. There's nothing to hold it in place. So 1 inch per width is a good general, again, guideline. For many drapery styles, buckram is optional. Like I showed you the silk panel, I didn't have buckram. And for Euro pleats, no buckram is used because the buckram will push forward and create sort of a little shadow line or a crease. Buckram does have great purpose, and that's in traversing draperies. You can crease the buckram. You actually break the buckram is the installation term. So it's folded and creased so that it goes back into position every time it's traversed. So if it's a drapery that's going to be opened and closed a lot, if it's a sheer, And especially if you have larger spaces, you'll want to use buckram because the larger spaces could crush without a buckram. But it is optional. If not using buckram, you can fold interlining into the heading or use interfacing. For shears, I've often used an iron-on interfacing or fusible web to give some stiffness without having the buckram showing. And there's also clear buckrams that you can use. It's okay to tack the pleats by machine. It's just a different look. I showed tacking pleats by hand. That's my most common way of tacking pleats, but I've certainly tacked hundreds of pleats by machine, especially for commercial work. Often for shears, I'll tack by machine because the hand stitching sort of can pull out easier. I can get a good back stitch on tacking by machine, and I can stitch into the buckram. So it just depends on the project. Increase your pleat sizes and the heading depth for taller windows so it'll look proportional. So you'll want to have on the big, tall, two-story windows a 7 or 8 inch pleat, and instead of using a 4-inch heading, you might want to have a 6 or 8 inch heading. It sounds huge, but when you look up at that tall window, it doesn't look huge. It looks proportional. So you can alter that depending on your project. Remember that the styles of pleats vary based on individual taste, design aesthetic, and trends. If you are a to-the-trade workroom, different designers might like different types of pleats. I've certainly experienced that. One designer likes a soft pleat that doesn't have buckram and looks a little more casual. Another designer might want the pleats like little soldiers standing at attention. So it really does go on individual taste. You can't say one is wrong because they're not. Just different taste and different looks, and trends, of course, affect all of this. And finally, there are just as many right ways as there are wrong ways. I've said it. I'd like to have a nickel for every time I've said there are at least 3 right ways for everything we do in the workroom. So don't get stuck on I have to pleat this way because I learned it in a book, or I have to pleat this way because Susan said so. Combine everything you learn to create a fabrication style that fits you and your experience, your equipment and tools. One reason that I do so much hand sewing is because when I started out, I didn't have anything but needles and thread, and it ended up being a niche market for me. But yeah, just always be open-minded when it comes to sewing. So that's all I have time for to share with you today, and I'm really, all I see is Melanie's question saying everything is good. So I'm going to go after the after I close up this live Hangout broadcast. I'm going to go on Google Plus, and there is an area for question and answer there, and that'll allow us to just keep the dialogue going, and I can answer additional questions. I hope that this has been interesting, that you picked up a tip or two about pleating, or perhaps you didn't really learn anything, but it's just affirming to see other people doing things the same way that you do. My next webinar is going to be on August 12th at 7 p.m. and the topic is Historic London Shades for Modern Workrooms. And if you'd like to register, you can go under the events on my Facebook page or on my blog on my website. The recording of this live presentation can be viewed on the Home Deck Gal YouTube channel. And if you'd like to purchase DVDs, recorded webinars, and the handouts from the webinars, you can find those on my website as well, homedeckgal.com. So I look forward to seeing you, and hopefully some of you are on the social networking channels listed below and online. If you're on Facebook, please join me on Facebook. I'm on Craftsy and Google+, LinkedIn, Pinterest. I love Pinterest, and I'm also a member of the Window Coverings Association of America. So thank you so much for joining me. It's really been a pleasure to share some of what I do in my workroom with you and share some of my mother's techniques that she taught me so that this sort of can live on, that we can all keep sharing. I don't have children, so in order to pass down this information, I'm sharing it with all of you. And I hope you have a great afternoon, and I'll see you online and hopefully see you in person soon. Thanks a bunch. Take care. Bye.